is Tasmania's acknowledgement of Tasmania's Aboriginal people. We acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional custodians of this land, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future who hold the memories, traditions, culture and hope of Tasmania's First Peoples. Libraries Tasmania also pays respects to the resilience and strength of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people and extends that respect to all First Australian peoples. Thank you, and I'd just like to introduce you to Maree Ring. There's her topic. So I will hand over. Thank you, Maree.
Thank you. If you can't hear me up the back, will you wave at me, please? Thank you for coming here today, and for Libraries Tasmania and especially Sandra for organising all the events for National Family History Month.
Oh, thank you, Maree.
Passengers, these days we'd call them pedestrians. Passengers passing by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so will you be. Prepare yourself to follow me. With life, there is the certainty of death, and all good genealogists and family historians will look for their ancestors and families' last resting places. Today we're looking at the burial grounds and cemeteries within the city of Hobart. And of course, most of the records for these burial grounds, except one, I think it's the Baptist Church, are held through the Tahoe, through the Archives Office. And of course, Tas Ancestry has a lot of information in there too. This talk was based on an article I wrote and was published in this volume of the Journal of the Tasmanian Family History Society, June 1994, but it's been extensively researched since then. Many of the journals of Tas Ancestry are available online at the link that's above, or journals are held by Libraries Tasmania, genealogical libraries as well. And these are the early cemeteries of Hobart, all 15 of them. 3 minutes each for 45 minutes. What do you reckon? Do you think I'll make it?
Does anybody have to go early?
So let's begin. Can you see that map okay? Soon after the establishment of every settlement, there has been a need for a burial ground or cemetery in which to bury the dead and at a discreet distance from settlement or camp. A burial ground was marked out in Hobart Town by the Lieutenant Governor Colonel David Collins and the Reverend Robert Knockwood on the 27th of April 1804. And of course, according to Knockwood's diary, the first burial there was for Mrs. Edwards' child, Elizabeth. And that was the next day after the cemetery was marked out. For many years, any deceased person from the southern parts of the colony to be buried, Protestant and Catholic alike, were interred in this burial ground. In the early 1820s, it was described as a place of real beauty, of rare seclusion, crossed by 2 crystal streams with fine old blackwood trees dotted through groves of wattle on the high ground. It wasn't until 6th of March 1823, when the Reverend Samuel Marsden travelled from Sydney, that St David's and the burial ground were formally consecrated. Though the Roman Catholic registers note burials from 1821, but more on that later. St David's remained the only other burial ground until 1828, when the Presbyterian churches and the Jewish community were each granted land for the internment of members of these faiths. Further land was for burial was granted to the Roman Catholics in about 1830. Yet transcription of the stones indicate that the cemetery was used earlier. St David's was an area of 6 acres bounded by Davey and what is now Harrington Street. I think it was called something else before. The deviation, was it? I'm not sure. And of course Salamanca Place. This burial ground has suffered periods of neglect since its opening, and soon after its closure in 1872 was described as a haunt for undesirable characters, and some with strong nerves even invaded the police by hiding in collapsed graves. And nursery girls were told to avoid the place, don't take their charges there. The Hobart City Council took control of the land, and it was advertised in 1922 to transfer headstones from the park. That was the park just before it was cleared. Very sad, but then graves do disintegrate depending on the stone and other things. Remains to be removed at person's own expense. The remaining headstones were replaced around the perimeter of the cemetery. The area was landscaped and opened as a park in 1926. The rotunda, which saw many carols by candlelight and band. A comparison of recent to 1926 when the corner on the Davey and Harrington Street was opened. So the trees have grown up marvellously. In October 1972, the Army removed the 24 remaining military headstones to Anglesey Barracks, where they're preserved in a memorial wall and gateway. Between 1972 and 1974, the council altered the layout of the headstones, much to the chagrin of the public, the headstones in St David's Park. The park was planted with some magnificent exotic trees, including elm, lime, beech, conifer and American giant redwood, and one single endemic blue gum, Tasmania's emblem, to remind us that it is not an English park. These grew well and used to shelter those who gathered annually for the carols by candlelight from 1949 to 2004. The event was deemed to have outgrown the park and transferred to Sandown Park, Sandy Bay, where it was presented as Carols by the Bay. But that did return to St David's and it held over 2 evenings. I don't think it's held there anymore, but anyway, the park is now used for many other community events. A monument to those transferred from Norfolk Island and First Fleeters was erected and dedicated on Sunday the 29th of November 1922. And where do you find records for St David's? Back to the church records. Those that were moved in 1976 were still there in 1976, is listed in this book. There were transcripts taken in 1926, and they are listed in the back of the book. I think that's the right date. Inscriptions are also here in Tahoe. And there's a few online sites. Gardens Family, Australian Cemetery Index, Billion Graves, Find a Grave, Monuments Australia. But probably the best one I find is the Gardens family, because they've been photographed and it's easy to search that one. Okay, the Roman Catholic burial ground, up on behind the cathedral now. A map of the ground. It consisted of 6 acres situated between Brisbane and Patrick Streets, high on the hill behind St Mary's, the school building. And that's a very distant view of it. The old stone boundary walls of the cemetery still run partway down each side of where the cemetery stood, protecting the well-kept playing fields of St Virgil. This cemetery has been described as having along its top boundary native cherry trees, under which the Aborigines used to sit and eat the fruit, while the good old priests sat by. Near these stood a graceful peppermint tree and occasional flowering box shrub. Bishop Wilson, who arrived in 1844, discouraged any inscriptions that did not have their source in the scriptures. He is also credited with putting a stop to the phrase, sacred to the memory of. In fact, many convicts of the Catholic faith were buried in the cemetery, and even those who were hung and executed, including bushrangers and their associates, were buried there. Like other cemeteries, after closure, the cemetery, many bodies of their loved ones to other burial grounds outside the city, and many of the headstones disappeared. Many a woman has unknowingly scrubbed her hearth or doorstop with a bit of sandstone, quarried by precocious boys from the old cemetery. By 1911, the remaining stones were removed and St Virgil's College built. Part must have been subdivided, as there are tales that from some houses built in Ben Street having tombstones and possibly bones found in their backyard. Records of burial indicate that burials have taken place from at least 1821. From transcriptions of the stones, the earliest surviving stone was 1825. During the floods of 1854, the influx of waters from Knocklofty filled the burial ground and completely washed away the lower wall. Next day, a coffin plate, supposedly from the burial there, was washed down from the ground and picked up at the lower end of Collins Street, so it must have been quite a flood then. Buried there is the first permanent clergyman, Father Connolly, and nuns, and certainly the nuns were transferred to Canadian Bay. Bushranger Matthew Brady and later 6 officers from the expedition ships La Strobe and La Zelle were buried there. A monument to the seamen was erected in 1866. These men are now commemorated in a more modern monument at Canadian Bay. These are the records available up on microfilm in Tahoe. And even though it was 1911 when they started to clear, the epitaphs were in 1916, so I'm not sure of those dates. The epitaphs have been published in the Tasmanian Ancestries too. Jewish cemetery, not far from the Catholic cemetery. Catholic cemetery here, and the Jewish little one there. And the laneway was originally from Harrington Street, but later we came off Warwick. It was small, about 1.5 acres, and in the records of the Chief Secretary's office, there is a letter dated for the 21st of May 1828, addressed to the Lieutenant Governor by B. Walford, acknowledging with heartfelt thanks the goodness of the Lieutenant Governor in being able to grant us a piece of ground as a burial field. Bernard or Barnard Walford was originally a convict in New South Wales and first to be buried there in 1828, so I think he must have had much heartfelt thanks to think that he was. This is a distant view of the burial ground was one of the many closed in 1872. It was reported to the Hobart City Council in 1901 that it was the only closed cemetery in a decent condition in the Hobart area. A man was paid to look after this ground. In 1945, the ground was sold. This money was sold for about £800. This money was forwarded to the survivors of the Holocaust. About 1952, the remaining 33 headstones from the period 1811 to 1871 were transcribed. The Windsor Court flats were built by the Housing Department with the remains of several people being reinterred in Canary Bay. There's no known list. I visited the site in 1997. I snuck up there one Sunday morning, and there were still several broken stones in existence at the site of the Windsor Court flats. And the stone of Lewis Lyons, the last stone to be proudly raised in this burial ground, was then lying face up, only barely legible and weathering badly next to the washing line at the flats and being used to stand on to put the washing on the line. I was probably trespassing and I was too embarrassed to do anything about it. And sadly I didn't take a photograph. In 2002, after the flats were demolished, an archaeological survey was undertaken. Preliminary investigations for the new development disturbed some remains. Further investigations found a total of 51 grave sites in the vicinity. Remains were exhumed and reinterred under supervision under the Sheva Kadisha in the Jewish section of Canadian Bay Cemetery. On the 7th of December 2002, a memorial service was held. And since the ground was cleared, new units have been built on the area. These are the memorial to those that were reinterred in that time. And each name has got a star on it. That's a transcript of headstones. Circa 1952, origin unknown, but it was held by the Tasmanian Family History Society, Hobart branch. No been published in that journal. And there's a Jewish calendar in there with it to make it easier to work out the names. St Andrew's Presbyterian. Now St Andrew's was down in Bathurst Street, St John's is in Macquarie Street, and both those churches, both Presbyterian churches, use this burial ground. That's looking down from Church Street. Everyone know where that is? It had an area of 1 acre, and the land was granted in 1828. Well, that's a spread maps again of the burial ground. And you can see the laneway down there to Patrick Street. Mrs. Smith. Thank goodness they don't call us that way now. You had to look up to find out that she was Judith Smith. After its closure in 1872, this ground too became neglected, and by 1902, with broken tombstones and those monumental structures closest to the street appeared to be gradually destroyed. Many of the vaults had fallen in, with their decaying contents visible. Blankets were hung out to dry on the railing of grave enclosures by housewives that lived nearby. That one shows the laneway. It was suggested that the epitaph that most occurred there was simply a native of Scotland. And I will digress for a minute and tell you a story about that I heard of boys on their way home from school hiding behind the fence in the cemetery, holding sticks with skulls on them, scaring the girls walking the same footpath on the other side of the pit. Boys will be boys and disrespectful, won't they? By December 1935, the cemetery, which was under the control of the Hobart City Council, was renamed St Andrew's Park. And that's probably taken about 1960. And I've marked the park in that lower right corner. Several large memorials were left in their original position, and many of the other headstones were placed along the boundary walls and an entrance path from Patrick Street. Currently is still a park with play equipment and still some monuments amid the lawns. I was up there last October, and no, it was earlier this year, February, and the council were up there clearing the paths and keeping it neat and tidy. Let's see some of the monuments. The laneway, with its pretty trees. If you want to go and see those pretty blossom trees, October, mid-October to late October is probably the best time. And that's what I'm using for the header for that Facebook page of mine. There is a plan of the burial ground, and you can see that it's a Tahoe. And the Tasmanian Family History Society have indexed not only the records for St Andrews and St John's, but in the back is the St Matthew's from Glenorchy, so all those burial grounds have been indexed. All those burial records. There's record of inscriptions, again in Tahoe stores. And as I said, the gardens is a good site to go on to. The person that's running that has got photographs and typed out the inscriptions. And there's another couple of on sites too. Holy Trinity Burial Ground, most people probably call it just Trinity, was the second area granted to those of the Anglican faith. It was situated at the northern end of Campbell Street and opened prior to January 1831. The Reverend Palmer had the ground level and a paling fence with gate erected. For several years he petitioned for it to be landscaped with some fragrant shrubs and trees and grass to be sown, so as to render the ground similar in appearance to places of interment in England. I've marked it up the top, reserved for the burial grounds of convicts. There was over 5,000 burials, and they're listed in the Holy Trinity Burial Register up to the closing of the cemetery in 1872. The majority were those of unhappy prisoners, numbers of whom were often huddled into one grave, mass and pauper burials. Those from the penitentiary and executed were not usually listed in the burial records of the church, and that's Kath and Brian Rosette. Early in the 20th century, it was reported that there were many burials of soldiers, officer and clergymen, including the first of the Trinity parish, the Reverend Philip Palmer mentioned above. Curiously enough, the majority of the headstones that had survived the vicissitudes of time and fortune were those erected to the memory of children, but there's very few, or nothing's really exists for it now. The children from the orphan school, which opened in 1828, were buried there until 1836. The remains of those buried were removed in 1923 to the paupers section of the Canadian Bay Cemetery, and some, alas, on closing, no known transcriptions of headstones was undertaken. And that's the corner with the cemetery there. Another one. That's taken in the 1960s with work being done on the underpass, an underpass going under Burnett Street to make it safe for the children to cross. And dedicated to the memory of over 5,000. And the monument designed by Brian Rosette. Burial records. Now, in amongst the records of the Heritage Office are removals to Canadian Bay, that AEF171, and this is what it looks like. It's not indexed. If you can see the second one down, it's Maree Ring, which is my husband's ancestor. Now, these were on cards, and it's online, but they are not indexed, so you can't, once you open it, you can't do a search for it, you have to go through it. There's lots there, well, 324, but they're all pre-1900. And for all cemeteries, but I picked this one because this was all Holy Trinity. By 1926, the ground of the Trinity was cleared and the Burnett Street extension and the Campbell Street Primary School was opened. And of course the playgrounds were built on the site of the old cemetery. The Society of Friends of Old Quaker Cemetery is off Mellifont Street, West Hobart in Providence Valley. Land had to be purchased for their burial ground in 1834. Now I snitched these from Facebook, don't tell anyone, and that shows Blue Star is the Hill Street one, but the red star is the Friends Cemetery. And that's I've taken it in closer so you can see. About 50 or 60 people were interred in this burial ground. It closed in 1912, and in 1926 it was leased to the Hobart City Council. Human remains were removed in 1936 and the land was transferred to the council, and half was developed as a children's playground. The 60 gravestones were arranged around the original 1830s sandstone boundary walls. At first it was known as Spence Park, and then by 1941 children's playground. Oh, that's a bit closer. And the trees that were there were formed into a sculpture probably about 10 years ago. And now it has a fence along protecting. I don't know if it protects it or not, because I was up there once and there was a tree limb down, and I probably had more chance of getting away from the headstones if there wasn't a fence there, but anyway. It is the tradition of the Quakers to have unassuming and uniform headstones, highlighting their theological beliefs. There are some records available. Might have been this group that haven't got their records upstairs. Now, there is photographs of the headstones online, and they're through Graves of Tasmania. They're calling it Hill Street, but it's actually the Quaker Cemetery. St John's, they're out at Newtown, the Maypole Rivulet that is the border for Hobart, just north of St John's. The cemetery of the now Anglican Church of St John's was situated to the west of the church near Orphan School. And the big star shows it. Within this burial ground was interred Charles O'Hara Booth, Captain of His Majesty's 21st North British Fusiliers, and was commandant at Port Arthur from 1833 to 1844. He died in 1851, just 30 days short of his 51st birthday, and buried at St John's. However, the cross from his grave was removed in 1963 and is now down at the Commandant's residence at Port Arthur. The burial ground was closed by an Act of Parliament in 1938. The remaining stones were removed by 1865, possibly to Canadian Bay. The only remaining headstones in the cemetery belongs to Matthew Forster, and that's his headstone I've marked. Matthew Forster was the Chief Police Magistrate, Colonial Secretary and Controller General of Convicts. He died in 1846, aged 49 years. As I mentioned previously, until 1836, burials from the orphan school took place at Trinity in Campbell Street. The first recorded burial at St John's was of a 12-year-old boy, Thomas Hibben Morgan, from the orphan school, which took place in December 1836. The last was of Archdeacon F.T. Whittington in December 1938. In this period of over 100 years, there was 2,000 burials. In 1963, many vaults and tombstones were removed to Canadian Bay Cemetery, with the remains relocated in the Church of England Section F. These removals were privately arranged. The largest vault was that of the Swan family. A few buildings have since been erected on the burial ground site, and only one memorial remains, that of Matthew Forster, the Comptroller General. Nothing remains to indicate the area once occupied by the burial ground, or there is a thing to inform people of its history, because the Friends of the Orphan School have at least done a memorial plaque to their children. So it's the children who died there. Of the children that died there, about 100 of the children were Catholics. And they were buried in a small Catholic cemetery on site. St John's and Queenborough stones seem to be a little bit mixed up out of the cemetery. And this publication by the Friends of the Orphan School lists the burials there. Something's happened. A meeting of the trustees of the Wesleyan Church was held in 8th of May 1833 to elect a subcommittee to select a piece of land for a burial ground. The ground, about half an acre, was bounded by Butterworth, Queen Adelaide, which is now called Hamilton, and Hill Streets. It had previously been owned by John Hiddlestone, but the records for the sale of the land hadn't been found. And that's that picture again showing where the Hill Street is. That's the only picture of, well, it's available. The first recorded burial took place on the 6th of January 1840, but it was not until April 1842 that the trustees of the church resolved to build a sandstone wall around the burial ground. A rambler through the cemeteries in 1902 commented that it was scarcely a stone there that does not invite the attention of the epitaph hunter. This was the only picture I had until I found that one on Facebook. And there's a picture of the wall, that's it. Nothing. In 1921 it was suggested that the burial ground should be handed over to the City Corporation for use as a reserve, but it was sold, and in 1926 and the graves and vaults were removed to Canadian Bay, where there are now 2 stone slabs with memorial inscriptions commemorating those buried. And that's the slabs. Time and weather have almost erased the inscriptions. In 1935, the land was sold and subdivided for housing. 4 interwar style houses were built. There are no visible signs of the site's former use, except this. And that was in oh, sorry, this is the last. There was a notice in the newspaper, when was it? 2016, I think. Yeah, 2016, of bones found when the people were digging. Rosemary Davidson published this about at least 20 years ago, all her work on it. And if anyone knows of any photos, please. St George's burial ground, Albury Street burial ground. Down here. Was situated on the corner of Byron Street and Sandy Bay Road. It was an area of 2.5 acres, yet in the return of 1857, the area was given as 5 acres. Records suggest the land on which there were almshouses was given to the parish in 1841-42, which extended the amount. excuse me, almhouse with the burial ground behind. Of course, St George's or Alvera Street burial ground closed in 1872. In 1902, the old cemetery was compared to other Hobart cemeteries and described as a model of tidiness, laid out in a definite plan, not higgledy-piggledy as in some cemeteries. By 1922, the cemetery was succumbing to the fate of collapse and ruin to be found in the other local cemeteries. In 1928, this burial ground was converted into a playground for the Alvera Street School. The school had been open since 1914, and I believe the school site has been sold and now developed as residential apartments. No list of headstones or transcriptions was made before the cemetery was levelled, though a few remained. Apparently stones from this cemetery were taken to Fitzroy Place and used for paving there, where an odd cut and illegible stone could be seen in 1994, I was told. About 6 or 7 years ago, the Hobart City Council erected a memorial wall on Sandy Bay Road with appropriate signage installed, made from broken headstones and supported by its stainless steel mesh framing. Unfortunately, few details are able to be read, and those that I could work out were listed in his ancestry. In the top one you can just see that it's the stone of Mary Smallhorn. I've circled it down the bottom. Very hard to read, just part of the stone. And the history was written by Leonie Mickleborough, and I did the transcription of the identifiable stones, and that's the list I got. Oops, I've left that one in there again just to remind you. That's where you need to go looking. Now, St George's Anglican burial records, granted in 1841. There is only one entry for 1846 and March 1858 to 1872 is okay. Then the next bit is for 1903, and then would have been to quite probably Queenborough Cemetery, and after that there's some. So that early period obviously lost. Okay, this is a distant view of the Roman Catholic cemetery, but you go right back on the hill and you can see the King's Curry sign, and it was near there that the Congregational cemetery was. That's a little bit closer. The Congregational was bounded by Wellesley Street and Congress Streets, with large eucalyptus trees growing along the Wesley Street boundary. There's an opening notice and a closure notice, 1834 to 1927. The charges are there. That cemetery didn't close in 1872 because it was outside the town boundary. And by 1875, it was reported that certain improvements had been made, and a mortuary chapel erected as a number of the burials had greatly increased. So I think the corner where the building is of our road is probably the Mortuary Chapel. In 1902, this burial ground, which was poorly drained, was closed by an Act of Parliament. And people were invited to remove the remains of their family at their own expense. It was later subdivided and for housing built upon. These early 20th century houses were in Wellesley and Congress Street. One gravestone, perhaps from this cemetery, is now illegible and thought to be part of the path of one of the nearby properties on the corner of Cascade Road and Congress Street. A plan of the burial ground was kept apparently, but extensive archival research reported by Catherine Bennett back in 2002 failed to find this. Some of the bodies were transferred to Cornelian Bay, and that looks like the date they were transferred, but there's no names. And that's where I've roughly drawn it. I must redo that nicely. But that's where the stones are, and these are the stones, and they're wearing profusely, as you can see the one on the right. Some have got that was taken a few years ago.
Yeah, they're really bad now. Nearly all lifted.
I can imagine. One on the... That one's badly done. We do have the names though. Has ancestry. That's the volume. So we do have the names, fortunately. And the Junior Society volunteers have published this one nearly 20 years ago, so. Newtown Congregational Church. I've listed that. Which one is it? Number 2. Yeah. Was opened in 1845 and the cemetery occupied the front area and rear of the church. The first burial recorded in 1847 was the death of Sarah Nisbet, wife of the Reverend John Nisbet and daughter of Henry Hopkins, a founding member of the Congregational Church in Tasmania, and later recognised as the father of Australian Congregationalism. Reverend Nisbet took up ministry at the church in 1852 and remained to his death in 1890. That's a better picture of the church. Another one. And I did have one just behind the maypole. So it's just up that hill. The cemetery closed in 1910, though there was a burial in 1918. The gravestones in the rear were removed in the 1950s, and those in the front to the side boundary to our garden. The only tombstones remaining in the church grounds in 1991 were for Myra Georgina Beliers, the Cato, Hopkins, including Clark, Nisbet and Oakes, and Hickman families. 9 years later, only the large Victorian vault for Henry Hopkins and his extended family remained, with 2 headstones propped against the front of the church. The church is now a private residence. Henry Hopkins. Now, the book on the Congregational burials at South Hobart also contain these ones from Davey Street, and I think Hester Granton would be Uniting Church now also. There's a graveyard out there. Again, from the good people at Tasmanian Family History Society, Hobart branch. Baptist Church, Baptist Cemetery, on the corner of Clare and Fraser Streets, and thought to be in use by the 1840s. The burial records of those transferred to Canadian Bay indicate this date. Since its closure in the early 20th century, the cemetery was subdivided and interwar style houses built there. I think I've kind of found it there. You never see close-up photos of cemeteries, you only see distant ones. Proposed closure. Carho's got one reference. And I was looking at this last night and I kept on going around in circles. There seem to be similar references. But anyway, we can always rely on Tasmanian ancestry. Okay, the female factory cemetery. Do people know there was a cemetery up there? Yes. The cemetery was located on a rectangular piece of land at the corner of Cascade Road and Sim Street. No, it was on where it's marked. It's McGrovey's Gully Road. And it was in use from the 1820s. But the factory wasn't established till 1828, till 1876. It was part of the Hobart Female House of Correction, female factory, which operated 1827 to 1877. The cemetery in 1873 was described by the Mercury as a pretty little green patch of 3/4 of an acre, and it has no denominational subdivisions. Prisoners, paupers and Jews, benign offenders of all creeds find a last resting place in the same spot, and a few graves are marked with neat little crosses and headboards, erected by friends and relations of those buried there. By 1876, Boyd, who was superintendent of the factory, reported on the overcrowded state of the cemetery to the Chief Secretary. Harsh conditions at the factory, partially created by the location of the complex in a dark, sunless and unhealthy area, caused high death rates among inmates and their babies. After 1869, large numbers were sent to the factory and even more burials to contend with. Parts of the factory were converted into an invalid depot, boys' reformatory, lunatic asylum, contagious venereal diseases hospital, a lying-in home and a home of mercy. The burial ground was not extended to accommodate demand as it was felt it was too close to the invalid depot. It was eventually decided to close the cemetery and the dead were taken to Canadian Bay for burial. On 8th of May 1876, Trinity, considered to be the last of the full-blood Aborigines, was buried there, even though she had requested her ashes be scattered in the Dontracasto Channel. Within 2 years, her skeleton was exhumed in secrecy by the Royal Society of Tasmania and later placed on display. Only in April 1976, approaching the centenary of her death, were Trigonetti's remains finally cremated and scattered according to her wishes. In 1904 and 5, the factory, including the cemetery, was sold to private purchasers. Houses and gardens now occupy the cemetery site. It is thought that there are some remains of the cemetery under existing houses, and I've been told by someone that used to work in the archives that this is so. There are no known records of the cemetery. Queenborough, you see it circled there? Established in 1873 because people Canadian Bay was established in 1872. People in the south of the city decided it was too far to go, so a private company, was established after the Queensborough residents complained of the expense, trouble and inconvenience travelling to the new burial ground, Canadian Bay. The cemetery was located on 12 acres of land that formed part of the Chaffey estate and was bought for £280 in 1873. It was situated above Sandy Bay Road, roughly between Peel Street and the sports field above Churchill Avenue. The cemetery was closed on 2 occasions due to unsanitary health conditions, and an inquiry revealed bodies had gone missing from graves. With the cemetery in disrepair and financial problems, the cemetery was purchased by the Hobart Corporation in 1917 and was closed for burials on 31st of March 1923. There were over 3,000 burials, and some of the residents of Sandy Bay were among the prominent citizens buried there. And just a few distant pictures of the cemetery again. That's the gates down in Tahoe, Mount Nelson Road. And if you look at this one where I've circled, there's a building there. There was a Mortuary Chapel. There's a little bit of it on the side, above the tomb. No distinct pictures of it. And behind that big tombstone board. And it was sold. It was going to be used as a pavilion for the sports oval down there. And I'm just wondering, I cheated off Mr. Google, I wonder if that was it, with its side removed. Don't know. But certainly the chapel became a sports pavilion. Back to this one. I showed you the one on the right when we had a look at the Mortuary Chapel. Now we've got this gorgeous great the bronze horse that was on the vault of Thomas Biggs Clark and his family. Thomas was the second son of Big William Clark, thought to be the first millionaire in Australia. The statue once marked Thomas's resting place in the Queenborough Cemetery. Some young boys, as a young boy living in Battery Point in the 50s, myself and other boys would sleep overnight in the scary Queenborough Cemetery for a day, and often sat on the horse before Hutchins School built on that site. It was removed sometime after the 1950s to the entrance of the Elwick Racecourse, and I did have a picture of that somewhere, but I can't find it. And then until about 2014, in the roadworks on the Brooker Highway, Howard Road, it was removed into storage. That's another pic of at Sandy Bay. Magnificent. And that's it now. It used to be Luxbet, Ubet, and now it's Ladbroke out at Elwick. I think everyone would know it as Elwick.
We know it as Elwick, don't
Anyway, Queenborough, the land was cleared in 1961 and has been used for recreation grounds, caravan park, part of the Hutchins School and the major link road, Churchill Avenue. A memorial garden for those people buried in the cemetery has been established in Peel Street. There is a number of re-erected gravestones within this garden. There was a special section at Cornelian Bay with many of the old gravestones from Queenborough. I think it was that one. I was trying to check that URL this morning and the computer froze, so I can check it. 11:45. Queenborough Cemetery books by the Tasmania Family History Society, Hobart branch. And of course, transcriptions of some of the stones are online. Upstairs, online. That's kind of what the transcripts look like. In 1843, I'm nearly finished. In 1843, a report on the sanitary conditions of Hobart Town stated that the 4 burial grounds situated within the limits of the city were a source of danger to health. Some poorly constructed vaults were opening up. Not enough soil covered the bodies, particularly those buried in convict burial grounds, and graves were not dug deep enough. In some of the cemeteries, this was not possible because the ground was so rocky. And another way disease spread was through decay of bodies, with this putrid material seeping into the rivulets of the town. Most of them were built up on the hills. A lot of the bodies weren't buried deep enough, and when it rained, bodily fluids were leaking. In 1847 and 1855, the Governor, Sir William Denison, an accomplished engineer, suggested the site of Government Farm on the point between Cornelian and Newtown Bays as the best site for a new cemetery. Cornelian Bay was chosen because it was only half a day walk from Hobart. Thank you. And could be contained easily in the event of any outbreaks. At least later on, and I don't know when the train started going through, but there's a train station at Cornelian Bay that people could have got from the centre of the town, from Newch. The residents of Hobart sought to close down the church burial grounds and open a public cemetery, but procrastination and financial problems did not cease for 2 decades. Finally, the burial grounds within the square mile of the city were closed for burials when Cornelian Bay Cemetery had its first burial in 1872. It was actually proclaimed open by His Excellency Charles Duquesne, Governor and Commander-in-Chief of the Colony of Tasmania, 2.5 months earlier, in July 1872. Even before the closure, there are some records of neglect of the church burial grounds, and this increased after their closure. Now, time's gone past, and I've probably talked nearly long enough, and I'll leave you with the teas, and hopefully I can cover the Cornelian Bay Cemetery another time, perhaps next year. But I will leave you with this question. Those burial grounds that were cleared but before reuse, were they totally cleared? I don't think so. A report in 2016 concerns remains at the front yard of the Hill Street home, the Wesleyan Cemetery. In 2011, a report at South Hobart mentioned bones being found near the old Congregational Cemetery, and I've been told some being found in the street behind the female factory. More bones were found when the underpass was being built from the Campbell Street School in the early 1960s, in the grounds of Hutchins School, St Virgil's, Albura. Can we only respect what our forefathers did or didn't do? Different times and different expectations. Now, another useful resource for researching your ancestors' burials are these, the Undertaker's records. And these have all been produced by the Tasmanian Family History Society branch volunteers. That one. Oh, those are cemeteries. Thank you.